Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe, the place where we explore important global topics and help you improve your English step by step through real-world issues, clear explanations, and calm discussions. My name is Adam, and today we begin with a question that many leaders, journalists, economists, and ordinary people across continents are quietly asking as they watch decisions coming from Washington, because the policies of Donald Trump are once again shaping conversations about trade rules, military alliances, immigration debates, and diplomatic relations. And when America moves in one direction, factories in Asia, energy markets in the Middle East, security planners in Europe, and developing economies in Africa all feel the effects in ways that are complex, connected, and sometimes controversial.
Hello everyone, I'm Julia, and I'm really happy you are spending your time with us today, because today's topic may sound serious at first, but please remember, our goal is always to slow things down and help you understand the world through clear and careful English. And when we talk about global criticism toward a political leader, we are not focusing on personality or emotion, but on policy impact, economic choices, military strategy, and international agreements that influence millions of lives. Because understanding how countries react to each other's decisions is one of the best ways for English learners to understand real-world news language and build confidence when listening to global discussions.
That's exactly right, Julia, because when people hear headlines saying that a president is facing global criticism, they sometimes imagine dramatic arguments or personal conflicts. But in reality, global criticism usually comes from governments and organizations responding to real policies about trade taxes, defense cooperation, immigration rules, environmental agreements, and technology competition. And since the United States plays such a large role in the world economy and security system, any change in American policy naturally brings reactions from partners, competitors, and neutral countries who are thinking about their own jobs, industries, borders, and future plans.
And this is why it is so important for learners to understand the difference between political debate and personal attack, because international criticism is often part of diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic communication, where countries express concern or disagreement in order to protect their interests. And in today's episode, we will explore how discussions about trade disputes, NATO cooperation, immigration policy, relations with China and Russia, climate agreements, and global media coverage are shaping how different nations respond to American decisions, while we keep our tone calm, balanced, and educational so that you can follow the conversation comfortably.
Imagine for a moment leaders from Paris, Tokyo, Ankara, Riyadh, and Brasilia reading reports about new tariff proposals, security speeches, or immigration reforms, and asking how those decisions might affect their export industries, their defense planning, their labor markets, or their diplomatic strategies, because when a country as influential as the United States adjusts its policies, it creates waves that move through shipping routes, financial markets, technology partnerships, and international negotiations, and those waves often become the reason why some governments express support, while others express concern or criticism.
And listeners, this is where today's topic becomes useful, not only for understanding politics, but also for improving your English listening skills. Because global news discussions often use the same ideas again and again, such as cooperation, competition, negotiation, influence, alliance, and economic stability. And when you hear these ideas in real contexts, you begin to understand not just vocabulary, but also the way English is used to explain complex situations clearly, which is exactly what we aim to do here on the English Globe, as we explore how global reactions are formed and why they matter.
In this episode, we will gently introduce several key themes that help explain why global criticism is growing in some areas, including trade disputes where tariffs and supply chains affect businesses around the world, NATO tensions where defense spending and security promises shape alliances, immigration policy debates that influence labor markets and humanitarian discussions, relations with China, Russia, and European partners that affect diplomacy and global stability, climate policy disagreements that influence environmental goals, and media reactions that shape public opinion in different countries.
Each of these themes shows us that international criticism is usually about consequences rather than emotions, because when countries react to policy decisions, they are thinking about economic growth, national security, public opinion, and long-term strategy. And by studying these reactions carefully, English learners can understand how global conversations work without needing to choose political sides or feel overwhelmed by complicated language, since our purpose is to explain ideas step by step and help you follow international news with clarity and confidence.
Before we continue, I want to clearly remind our listeners that this podcast is created for educational purposes and English learning only, and our goal is to analyze widely reported global discussions in a respectful and balanced way without promoting any political agenda, because understanding international relations is about listening carefully, comparing viewpoints, and learning how different countries think about shared challenges like trade, security, migration, technology, and environmental protection, all of which are connected to today's topic in meaningful ways.
And we are grateful that you are here with us, because learning English through real global issues is one of the best ways to build confidence, curiosity, and critical thinking at the same time. And as we continue through this episode, we will take each theme slowly, explain why different countries react differently, and show how global criticism can be part of normal international dialogue rather than a sign of conflict. So stay with us as we begin this journey into understanding why American policies today are creating strong conversations across the world and what those conversations mean for global cooperation and communication.
As we continue our discussion, let us first understand something very important in a calm and simple way, because when people hear the phrase global criticism, they often imagine anger or conflict, but in international politics, the meaning is usually more complex and more practical, since global criticism happens when governments, international organizations, economic partners, or global media question or disagree with the policies of a major country whose decisions influence markets, alliances, migration systems, and security planning around the world. And because the United States has such a large role in global trade and diplomacy, the policies of Donald Trump are watched carefully by many countries who study how each decision may affect their industries, borders, or long-term national plans.
That explanation is very helpful, Adam, because many learners think criticism always means dislike or personal attack. But in global politics, criticism is often a formal and structured response where countries explain their concerns through speeches, official letters, meetings, or international forums, and it can take many different forms depending on what policy is being discussed, such as diplomatic criticism when foreign governments question a decision, economic criticism when trade partners worry about tariffs or restrictions, security criticism when military allies fear changes in defense commitments, environmental criticism when climate groups react to energy policies, and public criticism when global media discuss the impact of new laws or strategies.
Exactly, Julia. And when we look at diplomatic criticism, we see foreign ministers or ambassadors speaking carefully about how a policy might affect cooperation or trust, because diplomacy is built on communication and balance. And when a country changes its approach to trade, immigration, or defense planning, other governments may express concern to protect their own interests, not necessarily because they want conflict, but because they need to explain how those decisions affect agreements, shared projects, or regional stability, which shows that criticism is often part of negotiation rather than a sign of hostility.
And when we talk about economic criticism, we are looking at reactions from trade partners, business organizations, and financial institutions who worry about supply chains, investment flows, market access, and currency stability. Because if tariffs increase or regulations change, companies may face higher costs, and workers may worry about jobs. And these economic concerns are expressed in reports, economic forums, and trade discussions where partners try to explain their position and encourage policy adjustments, showing that global criticism is closely connected to economic planning and long-term cooperation between countries.
Security criticism is another important type, because military allies depend on trust, planning, and shared commitments. And when a major country debates defense spending, troop presence, or alliance strategy, partner nations may ask questions about reliability and coordination, not because they want disagreement, but because security systems require clarity and stability. And if policies appear uncertain, allies speak openly in meetings or public statements to make sure that defense cooperation continues in a way that protects all members of an alliance, which again shows that criticism can be part of responsible partnership.
Environmental criticism also plays a strong role in global discussions, especially when climate policies or energy decisions change, because environmental organizations, scientists, and governments focused on sustainability want to protect global climate goals that affect agriculture, water resources, and natural disasters. And when a large economy adjusts its environmental strategy, other countries may express concern about emissions targets or energy transitions, not as a personal attack, but as part of a global conversation about shared environmental responsibility and long-term planning for the planet.
Public criticism from global media is another area we should understand carefully, because newspapers, television channels, and online platforms analyze speeches, laws, and international reactions in ways that shape public opinion around the world. And media criticism can sometimes be strong or emotional, but it often reflects debates happening inside governments and societies, where journalists ask questions about fairness, economic impact, security risk, or diplomatic strategy. And by listening to these discussions, English learners can better understand how different viewpoints are explained in international news language.
It is also important to remember that criticism does not always mean hostility or conflict, because in many cases it is a normal part of negotiation where countries use criticism to express pressure, request changes, or clarify expectations. And in international meetings, leaders often criticize policies while still working together on trade deals, security agreements, or environmental cooperation, which shows that disagreement and partnership can exist at the same time in global politics. And understanding this idea helps learners avoid confusion when they hear strong words in news reports.
So when we hear that global criticism is growing, we should think about it as a sign that policies are having real international impact, because countries only respond strongly when their economies, alliances, or public opinion may be affected, and this means global criticism is connected to influence and responsibility, since powerful nations shape global systems and must also listen to feedback from partners and competitors who want stability and fairness in trade, security, migration, and environmental policy, which are all shared challenges in today's connected world.
And dear listeners, understanding these ideas step by step helps you not only follow world news, but also build confidence in listening to serious English discussions. Because when you know what diplomatic criticism, economic criticism, security criticism, environmental criticism, and media criticism mean, you can understand headlines more clearly and think calmly about complex topics, which is exactly what we hope to do together on the English Globe as we continue exploring how global reactions are formed and why they matter in modern international relations.
As we move deeper into today's discussion, let us focus on one of the most important sources of global criticism, which is trade policy. Because when the United States changes tariffs, import rules, or trade agreements, the effects are not limited to American borders but travel through shipping routes, financial markets, and manufacturing networks across continents. And under the leadership of Donald Trump, the idea of America First has emphasized protecting domestic industries, encouraging local production, and reducing trade deficits. Yet these goals sometimes create tension with major trading partners such as China, the European Union, and Mexico, whose economies are deeply connected to American markets through exports, supply chains, and investment flows.
That's a very important starting point, Adam, because when tariffs are increased on imported goods, governments often describe it as a way to protect national workers and industries. But trade partners may see the same policy as a barrier that makes their products more expensive and less competitive in the American market, which can lead to frustration among foreign companies and policymakers who argue that higher tariffs increase costs for global businesses, reduce efficiency in international production networks, and create uncertainty for investors who depend on stable trade rules to plan factories, logistics systems, and long-term partnerships.
Exactly, Julia. Because modern trade is not simply about one country selling finished goods to another, but about complex supply chains where parts are designed in one nation, manufactured in another, assembled in a third, and sold globally. And when tariffs are placed on steel, electronics, automobiles, or agricultural products, companies must reorganize their sourcing strategies, renegotiate contracts, or pass higher costs to consumers, which is why supporters argue that tariffs encourage domestic production, while critics warn that they may increase prices and reduce competitiveness for industries that rely on imported materials.
Another concern raised by critics is the disruption of supply chains, because when businesses cannot predict whether tariffs will increase or decrease, they hesitate to invest in new factories or expand production lines. And this uncertainty can slow down global growth as companies delay decisions about hiring workers or purchasing equipment, while smaller firms in developing economies may struggle the most because they lack the financial flexibility to quickly adjust to sudden policy changes, making trade disputes not only a matter of national strategy, but also a challenge for everyday businesses operating across borders.
We also need to discuss retaliation tariffs, which happen when one country responds to new import taxes by placing its own tariffs on goods from the original country, creating a cycle where both sides raise trade barriers in order to protect domestic industries. And this back-and-forth strategy can affect farmers, manufacturers, and exporters who suddenly find their products facing higher taxes abroad, which in turn influences political discussions at home about whether trade protection is helping or hurting local economies in the long term.
Currency tensions are another important part of economic criticism, because when trade disputes grow stronger, countries sometimes worry about exchange rates and financial stability, and accusations of currency manipulation or unfair monetary practices can appear in economic reports or diplomatic meetings, adding another layer of complexity to trade disagreements, since exchange rates affect export prices, foreign investment, and the overall balance of payments between nations that are deeply connected through global financial systems.
And when we consider developing economies, the impact becomes even more complicated, because many smaller nations depend on exporting raw materials or manufactured goods to large markets like the United States, China, or Europe, and when major economies enter into trade disputes, demand patterns can shift suddenly, reducing orders for factories in Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Africa, which may lead to job losses or slower growth in countries that are not directly involved in the dispute, but are connected through global supply networks.
This shows us that economic criticism is rarely about simple disagreement, but about practical consequences for workers, companies, and consumers around the world. Because when tariffs increase production costs, companies may raise prices for everyday goods such as electronics, clothing, automobiles, or food products, meaning that trade policy decisions can influence inflation, purchasing power, and household budgets, which is why economists often debate whether protective trade measures strengthen national industries or create long-term challenges for competitiveness and global cooperation.
Supporters of strong trade protection argue that prioritizing domestic manufacturing can rebuild industrial capacity, reduce dependence on foreign suppliers, and strengthen national security in strategic sectors like technology or energy. Yet critics respond that global trade systems are built on cooperation, and mutual benefit, and that reducing trade openness can weaken alliances, slow innovation, and encourage other countries to form alternative trade partnerships, which may reshape international economic relationships over time in ways that are difficult to predict.
So when we hear that global criticism is growing around American trade policies, we should understand that these reactions come from economic concerns about costs, supply chains, retaliation measures, currency stability, and development impacts, rather than from simple political emotion. And by analyzing these trade disputes calmly and carefully, we can see how deeply connected today's world economy truly is, where a decision made in Washington can influence factories in Asia, farms in Latin America, and financial markets in Europe, reminding us that trade policy is not only about national strategy, but about international relationships that affect millions of lives.
As we continue our discussion, let us now look at another important area where global criticism sometimes appears, which is security policy and military alliances, because debates about defense spending, troop commitments, and strategic cooperation can strongly influence relationships between the United States and its allies in the NATO. And under the leadership of Donald Trump, conversations about burden sharing and alliance responsibilities have become more visible, since American leaders have often asked European partners to increase their defense budgets, arguing that shared security should also mean shared financial responsibility, while European governments carefully study how these discussions might affect long-term cooperation and trust.
That explanation is very helpful, Adam, because NATO is not just a military agreement, but a system built on coordination, planning, and confidence between many countries. And European leaders sometimes worry when debates about spending or troop commitments sound uncertain, not because they reject cooperation, but because alliances depend on predictability, shared strategy, and mutual trust. And when a major partner questions how much each country should contribute or how long security guarantees will continue, smaller nations especially may feel anxious about their safety planning and defense preparation in a complex global environment.
One major issue in these discussions is burden sharing, which refers to how the costs of defense are divided among member countries, because NATO guidelines encourage each nation to spend a certain percentage of its economy on defense in order to maintain readiness and fairness. And while some countries have increased their military budgets in recent years, others still spend less due to economic limitations or political priorities, which leads to debate about whether all members are contributing equally and whether differences in spending levels could weaken cooperation or create tension inside the alliance.
Another important topic is military spending expectations, because modern defense systems require advanced technology, training, infrastructure, and joint exercises. And when budgets increase, governments must explain those expenses to their citizens while balancing education, healthcare, and social programs. So European leaders sometimes express concern about rapid spending increases, not because they oppose defense cooperation, but because they want stability and realistic planning that matches their economic situation, showing how security policy is connected to domestic politics as well as international commitments.
Strategic independence in Europe is also part of this conversation, because some European policymakers discuss building stronger regional defense capabilities so that Europe can respond to crises even if American priorities change. And this idea is not necessarily against NATO cooperation, but reflects a desire for flexibility and preparedness, especially in a world where security challenges include cyber threats, regional conflicts, and emerging technologies. And these discussions show how allies think about balancing partnership with independence while maintaining stability.
And when we talk about global security balance, we are looking at how alliances affect relationships with other major powers. Because NATO's strategy influences diplomacy with countries like Russia and shapes cooperation with partners across Asia and the Middle East. So when debates about troop levels or commitments appear, other governments watch closely to understand how security systems might change, which means criticism or concern from allies is often part of a wider discussion about maintaining stability and preventing misunderstandings in a sensitive international environment.
It is also important to remember that allies express criticism because they care about the strength of the partnership, since strong alliances depend on open communication about expectations and responsibilities. And when leaders question spending levels or strategic plans, they are often trying to improve coordination and ensure that defense systems remain effective, which shows that criticism inside an alliance can be a sign of engagement rather than conflict, especially when countries continue working together in training missions, intelligence sharing, and peacekeeping operations.
Yes, and from an educational perspective, this topic helps learners understand how international relations work in real life. Because security cooperation involves negotiation, planning, and careful language rather than simple agreement or disagreement. And when we hear about debates between allies, we should remember that these conversations aim to maintain stability, protect citizens, and adapt to new global challenges, which is why discussions about defense spending, troop commitments, and strategic planning are common in alliances where many countries share responsibility.
So when news reports say that NATO partners are expressing concern or criticism, it usually means they are discussing burden sharing, military readiness, strategic independence, or global security balance, and these discussions reflect the reality that alliances must evolve with changing economic conditions, technological developments, and geopolitical risks, which is why open dialogue is necessary to maintain trust and cooperation in a system that protects millions of people across different continents.
Dear listeners, understanding these security debates helps you follow international news with more confidence because you can see that criticism among allies is often part of healthy cooperation rather than hostility. And by listening carefully to how leaders discuss spending, strategy, and shared responsibility, you will not only improve your English listening skills, but also gain a clearer picture of how global security partnerships work together to maintain peace and stability in an interconnected world.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to the English Globe, where we take complex global topics and make them understandable for English learners through calm and careful discussion. Today, we are exploring another important area of global criticism that often appears when major policy decisions are made: immigration policies. The rules that govern who can enter the United States, how many visas are issued, refugee acceptance programs, and border enforcement strategies are not only national matters. They are closely watched by governments in Latin America, Asia, and other regions, as well as international human rights organizations. For example, when the U.S. introduces stricter visa limits, restricts refugee entry, or changes asylum procedures, countries whose citizens travel, study, or work in the United States feel the effects immediately, and these changes can influence diplomatic discussions, trade agreements, and regional cooperation. In some cases, neighboring countries must adjust their own migration policies or offer additional support to displaced populations, which illustrates how a single national decision can ripple across borders in ways that affect millions of people and create international concern.
That's exactly right, Adam, because immigration policy is one of the few areas where domestic rules directly interact with international interests, and it becomes global news for several reasons. First, labor markets are affected because many industries in the United States rely on foreign workers, from agriculture and technology to healthcare and hospitality. And if visa quotas change, employers in both the US and abroad may struggle to find skilled employees. Second, student visas are a crucial concern, as thousands of young people from Asia, Latin America, and Africa rely on American universities to study, gain skills, and participate in exchange programs, and changes in visa availability can influence international educational cooperation and the global talent pool. Third, family reunification policies are closely monitored because separating or delaying families can lead to humanitarian concern and diplomatic discussions, especially when foreign governments advocate for their citizens abroad. Fourth, refugee protection policies draw attention from international human rights organizations and foreign governments, because decisions about accepting refugees have ethical, legal, and regional consequences. And finally, cross-border cooperation in migration management becomes critical when countries must coordinate on security, transport, and humanitarian aid, which is why immigration policies are never simple and always involve legal and diplomatic complexity.
Exactly, Julia. When we analyze immigration policy, it is important to remember that these decisions are influenced by multiple factors, including national security, economic priorities, and humanitarian obligations. Border enforcement measures, for instance, are often designed to prevent illegal entry, but they also influence the perception of the United States among neighbors in Latin America, who may see these policies as restrictive or unfair. At the same time, Asian partners and international organizations watch closely how the U.S. treats students, professionals, and refugees, because those policies can affect bilateral cooperation in education, trade, and even technology. The interaction between national rules and global expectations makes immigration policy a topic of both domestic debate and international scrutiny, which is why it consistently appears in global news coverage when changes are announced.
And it is also important for English learners to notice how the language used in discussing immigration reflects both complexity and diplomacy. Terms like visa quotas, asylum procedures, refugee resettlement, and labor mobility may sound formal, but they describe processes that have very real effects on people's lives, families, and jobs. Countries often respond not with anger, but with formal statements, negotiations, or requests for clarification, showing that criticism can be a method of communication designed to protect citizens' rights and maintain cooperation, rather than a direct confrontation. Understanding this nuance is important for learners because it teaches how global issues are discussed in professional English, where words are chosen carefully to balance diplomacy, law, and humanitarian concern.
Another key aspect to consider is how changes in immigration policy can influence regional stability and international collaboration. For example, when refugee intake programs are adjusted in the U.S., countries in Latin America or Europe may need to offer additional support or implement temporary policy changes, while international organizations like the United Nations monitor compliance with global humanitarian standards. Additionally, visa restrictions or extended processing times can affect the flow of skilled workers, which may slow down international projects or reduce the availability of talent for multinational companies. In every case, the consequences are not limited to national borders, which is why global reactions are so common and why leaders must weigh domestic priorities against international obligations.
Yes, and when we talk about cross-border cooperation, it is also important to highlight legal frameworks that regulate migration, work, and refugee rights, because every country has its own laws, and international agreements often require dialogue and negotiation to prevent misunderstandings. The complexity arises because policies must balance security, economic needs, and humanitarian responsibility simultaneously. For example, a policy designed to increase border enforcement may also need provisions for family reunification or protections for vulnerable populations to meet international standards, and this delicate balance often generates debate, commentary, and sometimes criticism from other governments, human rights organizations, and the media, all of which are part of the normal diplomatic process.
So, when we hear that the United States is facing global criticism for immigration policies, it is rarely about hostility or personal disagreements. Instead, it is a reflection of how interconnected nations are in today's world. Decisions about visas, refugee programs, border security, and student exchanges directly influence economies, labor markets, educational opportunities, and humanitarian efforts across multiple regions, and the responses from Latin American countries, Asian partners, and international organizations show how seriously these policies are studied and debated, emphasizing the importance of diplomacy, clear communication, and careful implementation to maintain cooperation and trust.
Dear listeners, understanding immigration policy and global reaction is a great example of how real-world topics help you improve your English while learning about international issues, because it teaches you new vocabulary, shows how professionals discuss sensitive matters, and helps you see that criticism in international relations is often constructive rather than hostile. By listening carefully, you can understand how labor markets, student visas, family reunification, refugee protection, and cross-border cooperation all interact in complex ways, giving you insight into both English language usage and global decision-making processes, which is exactly what we aim for here on the English Globe.
Today, we turn to one of the most closely watched aspects of international policy that often drives global criticism: relations with China and Russia, because these two countries represent major strategic competitors and partners simultaneously in areas such as trade, technology, and military influence, and every policy decision made by Donald Trump is carefully analyzed by Beijing and Moscow for its implications on regional power, economic cooperation, and diplomatic alignment. When the United States implements tariffs, export controls, or investment restrictions, China evaluates how these measures affect its technology sector, supply chains, and domestic innovation, while Russia observes how American sanctions, troop movements, or arms agreements influence its relationships with European neighbors and global partners, creating a complex web of geopolitical considerations where every action is measured, studied, and often met with formal responses, diplomatic statements, or policy adjustments aimed at protecting national interests.
That's an important observation, Adam, because international criticism in this context is rarely about personal disagreement. It is almost always a strategic response to policy impacts that can influence global stability, regional security, and economic growth. European nations, for example, closely monitor American policies toward Russia because they directly affect NATO's security planning, energy supply lines, and regional defense strategies, and any sanctions imposed on Moscow can ripple across European markets, influencing natural gas pricing, trade flows, and investment decisions. At the same time, global media coverage amplifies these concerns, analyzing how US-Russia policies interact with conflicts in Ukraine, Syria, or other regions, helping people understand the balance of power without necessarily drawing partisan conclusions, and providing learners with real examples of how diplomatic language frames criticism without escalating conflict.
Technology competition is another critical factor in the relationship with China, because access to advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, telecommunications infrastructure, and cybersecurity tools has become a central concern for national security and economic growth. Policies that restrict Chinese companies from obtaining sensitive technology or encourage domestic innovation in the United States are interpreted by Beijing as both a challenge and a signal to accelerate domestic research, creating a competitive environment where global criticism emerges in statements from ministries, economic forums, and international organizations that monitor trade and intellectual property. These interactions show that policy decisions can trigger not only political debates but also long-term strategic planning on both sides, and that criticism in these contexts is analytical, structured, and aimed at influencing behavior rather than expressing personal opposition.
Energy markets are also deeply connected to US relations with Russia and China, because Russia is a major supplier of natural gas and oil to Europe and parts of Asia. And any changes in sanctions, export policy, or pricing agreements have immediate consequences for global energy security and economic stability. When the United States imposes sanctions or modifies energy cooperation programs, countries dependent on Russian energy must adjust their policies, negotiate alternative supply agreements, or explore renewable solutions, and these reactions are often expressed diplomatically or in policy debates, demonstrating that global criticism frequently reflects careful planning to maintain regional stability, protect national economies, and respond to energy dependencies in a world where supply chains are interlinked and market fluctuations affect millions of people.
Regional conflicts also play a significant role in shaping criticism toward U.S. policies, because actions taken by Washington influence security outcomes in areas where China and Russia have strategic interests, such as East Asia, the South China Sea, Eastern Europe, or the Middle East. When the United States supports certain military or diplomatic initiatives, Beijing and Moscow carefully analyze potential responses to ensure their own strategic objectives are met while avoiding unnecessary escalation. Criticism, therefore, often appears in the form of policy statements, parliamentary discussions, or international press coverage that highlight disagreements on procedures, objectives, or consequences rather than expressing hostility, showing that measured, legal, and procedural language dominates global diplomatic discourse in these contexts.
The broader concept that ties these issues together is the global power balance, because China, Russia, and the United States are all major players whose policies influence international norms, economic trends, and security agreements. When the United States adjusts its stance on trade, military cooperation, or regional conflicts, it is not acting in isolation. It is part of a dynamic system where other powers respond to maintain influence, protect economic interests, and ensure strategic security. Diplomatic criticism from Beijing, Moscow, or their partners often reflects calculations about power, leverage, and risk management, providing a clear example of how policy analysis, rather than speculation or emotion, drives international commentary and responses.
Sanctions are a tangible example of this approach, because they are a deliberate tool designed to influence behavior without resorting to direct conflict. When Washington implements sanctions on Russian entities or Chinese firms, the intended effect is often to modify policy decisions, deter undesirable actions, or encourage compliance with international agreements, while critics in the targeted countries highlight economic consequences, question legality, or demand negotiation, which is precisely the type of global criticism we are discussing: structured, policy-driven, and focused on outcomes rather than personal opinion. Observing these exchanges helps learners understand how international relations rely on predictable mechanisms of accountability and communication.
Yes, and focusing on policy rather than personalities also demonstrates why careful English is used in international discussions. Terms like strategic competition, sanctions, technology transfer, energy security, and regional influence may seem abstract at first, but they describe concrete actions and consequences that affect economies, alliances, and populations. By examining statements from governments, organizations, and media, English learners can see how criticism is framed in professional language, where clarity, diplomacy, and evidence-based argumentation are prioritized over emotion, which is exactly the type of structured discussion we aim to teach on the English Globe.
In summary, global criticism related to China and Russia reflects careful analysis of U.S. policies concerning trade, technology, military commitments, sanctions, and regional conflicts. These criticisms are designed to communicate concerns, influence outcomes, and maintain stability in a complex international environment, and they provide a clear illustration of how strategic thinking, economic interests, and security considerations intersect in the modern world. By following these discussions, listeners can observe both the causes and effects of global criticism while improving their English understanding of serious, professional international topics.
Understanding these dynamics is essential because it allows learners to distinguish between emotional reporting and policy analysis. When nations respond to US decisions about China and Russia, they are engaging in structured dialogue aimed at shaping international behavior, protecting regional interests, and maintaining global stability. By listening carefully to these examples, learners not only gain insight into geopolitics but also acquire English vocabulary and sentence structures used in professional real-world discussions, which helps build confidence for both comprehension and communication in global contexts.
One of the most visible areas of global criticism today involves climate policy, because decisions made in the United States have far-reaching consequences for international efforts to address global warming, and under the leadership of Donald Trump, shifts in participation in climate agreements, emissions targets, and energy strategies are closely watched by governments, scientists, and environmental organizations worldwide because the U.S. is one of the largest producers of carbon dioxide, and any change in domestic policy, whether withdrawing from international commitments or promoting fossil fuel production, affects the ability of the global community to meet shared climate goals, influence global temperatures, and plan for sustainable development across continents, making each policy decision a matter of international interest and analysis.
Exactly, Adam. And it is important to understand why European governments and environmental groups react so strongly to these policies. Because climate agreements rely on collaboration and trust among major economies, and when the US adjusts its emissions targets or energy policy, countries in the European Union or organizations such as the United Nations must reassess global strategies, funding, and cooperative programs, since renewable energy projects, carbon reduction initiatives, and climate adaptation plans often depend on US participation to succeed, and environmental groups amplify this reaction through research reports, public statements, and advocacy campaigns to ensure that policy changes are recognized and debated in a way that maintains global accountability.
Emissions targets are particularly critical because they set legally binding or voluntary goals for reducing greenhouse gas production. And when the United States adjusts its targets, it directly influences international climate negotiations, as many countries link their own goals to U.S. performance and progress, and these targets affect everything from industrial planning and energy production to transportation and urban development, meaning that criticism from abroad is often technical and policy-based, focusing on measurable outcomes, scientific data, and the potential consequences for global temperature projections, rather than personal or political disagreement, which provides a clear example of professional global discourse.
Energy policy also generates significant international discussion, because choices regarding fossil fuels, natural gas, nuclear power, and renewable energy directly affect global markets, trade flows, and investment priorities. And when the United States increases domestic oil production, limits renewable energy subsidies, or changes regulations on coal, other countries analyze the economic, environmental, and technological implications carefully, often expressing concern in forums, diplomatic channels, or international conferences, which shows how environmental criticism is not about emotion, but about assessing how national decisions can influence global energy security, sustainability, and climate progress simultaneously.
Competition in renewable energy is another important area because the United States plays a central role in research, development, and production of solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and energy storage technology, and when domestic policy favors certain industries or slows the transition to cleaner energy, international partners, investors, and environmental organizations react by highlighting the potential for lost opportunities in the global clean energy market, emphasizing that criticism often comes from a shared interest in accelerating technological progress and meeting global sustainability targets, rather than from opposition to American leadership or intent, which demonstrates how policy-driven dialogue functions in the international arena.
Global climate conferences such as the Conference of Parties (COP) provide a platform where countries openly discuss policies, report on progress, and negotiate commitments, And when the United States modifies its stance on emissions, energy subsidies, or environmental standards, these conferences become a focal point for criticism, because other nations must consider how American decisions affect collective targets, climate finance, and shared adaptation programs, and the language used is often technical, legal, and diplomatic, showing learners how professional discussion differs from media opinion or casual commentary, and emphasizing that criticism in this context is a tool for coordination and accountability.
It is important to note that environmental criticism is rarely hostile. Instead, it is typically structured, fact-based, and aimed at influencing policy outcomes and maintaining global standards, because climate change is a shared challenge that requires cooperation, monitoring, and transparent communication. And when international partners express concern about U.S. policies, they do so to ensure that commitments to carbon reduction, renewable energy adoption, and global climate goals are respected, illustrating the practical nature of criticism as a mechanism for accountability and mutual progress rather than conflict or personal disagreement.
Finally, understanding these dynamics helps English learners recognize how complex global topics are discussed in professional contexts, because terms like emissions targets, renewable energy, climate adaptation, and international accountability appear frequently in policy reports, news articles, and diplomatic communications, and by following these discussions calmly, learners can improve their comprehension of advanced English vocabulary while observing how criticism is framed as an analytical, factual, and cooperative tool, which is essential for anyone interested in both global affairs and effective English communication in international debates.
Adam. Another critical aspect of global criticism revolves around media coverage and public perception, because in today's interconnected world, statements, policies, and decisions made by Donald Trump are instantly broadcast across international news networks, online platforms, and streaming services, meaning that every speech, tweet, press conference, or policy announcement can influence how foreign audiences perceive the United States, its leadership, and its priorities. International press outlets often report these events within hours, and depending on the framing, they can amplify concerns, highlight successes, or question policy effectiveness, which shapes diplomatic dialogue, investor confidence, and public opinion in allied nations, as readers, viewers, and policymakers interpret not only the content of statements, but also the tone, timing, and emphasis used in reporting, creating a feedback loop where media coverage itself becomes part of the global conversation about American leadership. Julia.
Exactly, Adam. And social media has added another layer to this dynamic, because platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook allow instant dissemination of statements and reactions from world leaders, journalists, experts, and ordinary citizens, meaning that public perception is formed not only by formal media reporting, but also by direct commentary, shares, and discussion online. Speeches, interviews, or short posts can be analysed by governments, media organisations, and policy think tanks, and viral reactions can pressure diplomats or influence negotiations, demonstrating that public opinion is not a passive measure, but an active factor that can affect the interpretation of policies, the reception of international announcements, and the tone of diplomatic engagement, which is why understanding the role of social media in shaping perception is essential for following global criticism today.
Adam. Political communication style is also significant in shaping international reactions, because the way policies are announced, whether through formal speeches, informal statements, or social media posts, affects credibility, clarity, and reception abroad. Allies and competitors alike interpret tone, word choice, and consistency to assess reliability, predict future actions, or gauge the seriousness of commitments, and journalists often highlight contradictions or emphases that reinforce narratives of uncertainty, confidence, or concern. The speed of modern communication means that small details, repeated phrases, or casual remarks can quickly be amplified across continents, influencing public opinion in countries as diverse as Germany, Japan, Brazil, or South Korea, and shaping the context in which policymakers make decisions. Julia.
International press reactions are particularly important because reporters and editors select which events, quotes, and developments to emphasize, creating narratives that can influence readers' understanding of US leadership. Coverage may focus on trade decisions, defense statements, climate policies, or immigration rules, and the language used in headlines and articles can frame these actions as controversial, decisive, or uncertain. Governments monitor this coverage closely because it reflects how their populations interpret US actions and may even inform official diplomatic responses, demonstrating that media narratives themselves are part of the global dialogue, providing insights into expectations, concerns, and areas where engagement may be necessary to maintain trust and cooperation.
Social media diplomacy has become a particularly visible factor because leaders, political commentators, and citizens can post reactions in real time, turning a single statement into a global conversation that reaches millions of users instantly. Tweets, retweets, and online commentaries can influence perception not only in allied countries, but also among neutral or rival nations, and when statements are repeated, debated, or misinterpreted, they can create additional pressure on policymakers to clarify, adjust, or reinforce positions. This constant cycle of observation, analysis, and reaction illustrates how communication channels themselves, formal and informal, are central to the way global criticism develops and spreads.
Public opinion in allied countries is shaped by both traditional media and social media engagement, because people form judgments about foreign leaders based on the information they consume daily, and these opinions can influence domestic politics, voting behavior, and diplomatic expectations. For example, if citizens perceive US policy as threatening, unfair, or inconsistent, their governments may feel pressure to negotiate more firmly, issue statements, or adjust bilateral agreements, which demonstrates that criticism is often an outcome of perception management as much as policy content, highlighting the critical link between communication, influence, and international relationships.
It is also important to understand that global criticism emerging from media coverage and social platforms is rarely personal, but is instead a reflection of public understanding, analysis, and concern. Analysts, journalists, and citizens focus on outcomes, implications, and patterns of behavior rather than emotions, using media channels to highlight issues such as trade, security, or environmental policies. By observing these reactions, listeners can see how effective communication, transparency, and consistency contribute to maintaining credibility, building trust, and managing expectations, all of which are essential components of international diplomacy in a digital era where information moves faster than ever.
For English learners, studying this aspect is particularly useful because it demonstrates how professional language, news reporting, and public discourse intersect to shape international perception. Terms like media narrative, public opinion, social media diplomacy, and political communication describe not only abstract ideas, but also real-world mechanisms by which criticism forms, spreads, and influences decisions. By analyzing these examples, learners can understand both the content and context of global discussions, improving vocabulary, comprehension, and confidence when following news, social media conversations, or professional briefings about US policy and its worldwide reception.
While much of the discussion we've had so far has focused on global criticism, it is important to remember that not all countries respond negatively to US policies under Donald Trump. Because some governments see clear advantages in approaches that emphasize strong trade protection, firm immigration control, or security-focused diplomacy, and these supportive reactions often reflect shared priorities rather than ideological alignment. For example, nations that are seeking to renegotiate trade agreements, protect domestic industries, or strengthen border enforcement may view American policies as examples or leverage points that validate their own initiatives, showing that global responses are not uniform, but are instead shaped by national interests, economic strategies, and security calculations. This perspective highlights how international relations are multi-layered, where the same policy can be praised in one region and criticized in another, emphasizing the need for nuanced understanding rather than simplistic judgments about support or opposition.
Exactly, Adam. And there are several reasons why leaders in certain regions may welcome or align with these policies. Stronger border control models, for instance, are appealing to countries that are managing complex migration flows because observing US enforcement strategies provides both practical guidance and political justification for similar domestic policies. Similarly, trade renegotiation opportunities created by American tariffs or protectionist measures can allow other governments to push for more favorable terms in bilateral agreements or extract concessions that were previously difficult to achieve. These reactions illustrate that policy alignment is often transactional, grounded in strategic benefits, and responsive to shifting economic and political realities, rather than personal approval or ideological affinity.
Security cooperation is another major factor in why some governments support Trump's policies, because nations facing regional instability or threats from non-state actors value predictable and decisive U.S. engagement in defense matters, including joint exercises, intelligence sharing, or logistical support. When American policy emphasizes strong alliances, rapid response to threats, or prioritization of national security, it can reassure countries in volatile regions that their safety interests are taken seriously, which reinforces collaboration and trust. Support in this context does not mean blind agreement, but rather a recognition that aligned security priorities can enhance stability, protect citizens, and provide a framework for long-term cooperation.
National sovereignty is also a key reason why some governments view these policies positively, because Trump's emphasis on prioritizing national decision-making resonates with countries that are asserting independence in economic, political, or defense matters. This includes nations that wish to reduce external influence, manage domestic resources independently, or negotiate agreements on their own terms without outside pressure. In these cases, American rhetoric and policy that emphasize sovereignty and self-reliance serve as both a symbolic and practical reference point, reinforcing the idea that countries can assert their priorities while still engaging in international diplomacy, and demonstrating how complex international reactions are often shaped by perceived alignment of strategic goals.
It is also important to highlight that support is not static. It varies depending on context, timing, and specific policy areas. A government may approve of U.S. trade protection measures, but express caution about climate policy changes, or it may appreciate security cooperation while questioning immigration rules. This variability underscores that global politics is not simple or binary. Each country evaluates policies through the lens of its own interests, capabilities, and relationships with other nations. Understanding these subtleties is critical for learners who want to grasp how diplomacy, negotiation, and international strategy function in practice, as well as for following news coverage that may oversimplify complex reactions.
From an educational perspective, this section demonstrates the importance of analyzing global criticism alongside global support, because both are informative for understanding international relations and English language discourse. Terms like sovereignty, trade renegotiation, security cooperation, and border control models appear frequently in professional reporting, diplomacy, and academic discussions. And by examining how countries balance criticism and support, learners gain a more complete picture of how policies are interpreted, debated, and communicated on the world stage. This approach encourages careful listening, critical thinking, and comprehension of nuanced English in real-world contexts.
In conclusion, recognizing why some countries support U.S. policies provides a balanced understanding of international reactions, showing that global politics is a mosaic of interests, priorities, and strategic calculations. While criticism is important for accountability and diplomacy, support highlights shared goals, potential cooperation, and opportunities for negotiation. For listeners, appreciating this complexity not only helps with understanding world events, but also reinforces the way English is used in professional and analytical discussions, allowing learners to follow international news with confidence, clarity, and insight into multiple perspectives.
Exactly, Adam. By considering both criticism and support, we can see that global responses are rarely simple or one-sided, and learning to interpret these subtleties improves both language skills and knowledge of international relations. Observing how governments respond to U.S. policies, whether in trade, security, immigration, or diplomacy, offers English learners a real-world window into professional communication, policy analysis, and global strategy, preparing them to engage thoughtfully with international news, academic discussions, and professional conversations in English.
As we reach the end of today's discussion, it is important to reflect calmly on the main points we have explored. Global criticism of Donald Trump often arises not from personal disagreements, but from the real-world impact of policies that influence trade, security alliances, immigration, and climate initiatives across the globe. Decisions made in Washington ripple outward, affecting economies, regional stability, and international cooperation, and both praise and criticism can emerge depending on how countries perceive these actions. Media narratives and social media also play a significant role, shaping public opinion and diplomatic conversations, so understanding these perspectives helps listeners follow world events with more clarity. By paying attention to these interactions, you not only learn English in a real-world context, but also gain insight into the complexity of international relations and how nations communicate and negotiate with one another.
Absolutely, Adam. Following global news in English is a powerful way to build your language skills while thinking critically about world events. It teaches you to recognize multiple perspectives, understand policy impacts, and respect differing viewpoints, all while improving comprehension of professional vocabulary and structured discussion. The world is interconnected, and diplomacy, cooperation, and peaceful dialogue remain essential for addressing challenges together. Our hope is that listeners take away not just knowledge of policies and reactions, but also a sense of curiosity, understanding, and optimism about the ways countries can work together through thoughtful communication and shared responsibility.
So, as you continue to follow international news and explore English through real-world topics, remember that both criticism and support are part of global discussions, and learning to see the balance helps you think clearly, listen attentively, and engage confidently.
Thank you for spending this time with us. Stay curious, stay calm, and continue learning, because understanding the world in English opens doors to knowledge, dialogue, and meaningful connections across borders.